AEW is preparing for what looks to be the biggest 60 days in the short history of their company, starting with the premiere of its new Rampage show on TNT on August 13th. Their new show is about to debut. We'll be covering that here on the podcast. I'll have to figure out exactly if I'm going to go live after Rampage or just cover it that Sunday. That first show, I might just go live that night, but we'll see. But Rampage is coming up on the 13th. They're going to get an extra hour of television each week. That is building to the All Out pay-per-view in Chicago Labor Day weekend. And then they have a string of big shows on the road up and down the East Coast, including their New York City debut at Arthur Ashe Stadium in front of what, by the time we get to the event, is going to be what looks like just shy of 20,000 fans. The biggest audience for any show in company history. And now this week, the news that rocked the wrestling internet. It started with a report from Sean Ross Sapp on Fightful Select that CM Punk, who has not wrestled a match since the Royal Rumble in 2014, it was the very next day before Raw that he walked out on WWE and he never looked back. They reported that Punk was in discussions for an in-ring return and that AEW was the most likely landing spot for him. Higher-ups in WWE believe that he's AEW bound. And now the owner of Bodyslam.net, Cassidy Haynes, and they're a website that has broken stories before, he isn't confirming a Ringside News report that Punk officially signed his AEW contract on Friday, but he is saying he does believe the report that Punk has already signed his AEW contract within the last few days. Now, outside of a couple of run-ins at independent events under a mask, Punk has been completely removed from pro wrestling, save for his one stint as an analyst on WWE Backstage on FS1, which was a failure. It did not draw big numbers. The only reason they put CM Punk on that show was because they thought that it would create a buzz for the show and it would bring in an audience, and it didn't really work. And it was never going to draw big numbers because, number one, at the end of the day, it's an analysis show on an actual sports network about something that isn't a sport. And I love when wrestling can be a little more sports-oriented. They introduce elements of realism in sport. I'm all for that. But let's be honest, it's an analyst show, about professional wrestling on an actual sports network. It was never going to draw a big audience. And it wasn't going to draw a big audience for Punk anyway, because the people who want to see CM Punk back never wanted to see him back as an analyst. They didn't want to see him sitting at a desk. They didn't want to see him Skyping in from somewhere or sitting in a studio. They wanted to see him back in the ring. And the microphone. But when you look at the wrestling landscape, of all of the free agent names that are out there, Punk is one of only two names that wrestling fans would consider truly big. All right, it was 3 until Samoa Joe signed with NXT. Now it's 2. Punk is one of those names. And the other is Bryan Danielson. And that was the other bombshell report this week from Bodyslam.net. It also, the website crashed after they posted their initial report. The traffic was just so heavy that it just buckled, I guess, under the weight of everybody who was trying to access the site. But they were told by an AEW source that Danielson is 100% locked in and signed with AEW. The conversations with Bryan came first and were very recent, as in the last 2 or 3 weeks. They got the deal done with the idea of debuting him at their New York City debut at Arthur Ashe Stadium. And then Punk started to show interest. And that threw a bit of a monkey wrench into their plans once they realized that Punk was possibly going to be coming in. They had everything mapped out through All Out, at least. And now the company is said to be figuring out how those plans might change, if at all, with both of these guys coming in. Now with Punk, as you would expect, they want him in Chicago. But they have 3 different Chicago events leading up to and including All Out. They have 3 dates in Chicago. First, it's Dynamite, the Wednesday before the pay-per-view. Then Rampage on Friday, and then All Out on Sunday, all in the same building. It could be any of those 3 shows. That is what we know so far. That is the timeline of events. With Bryan, WWE tried to keep him. We heard reports not too long ago that Nick Khan was in discussions with New Japan Pro Wrestling about a possible exclusive partnership. That was reported in The Observer. And not only did those talks obviously not go anywhere, New Japan has doubled down on its working agreement with AEW since then. In fact, we just saw one of its championships change hands on TNT on Wednesday night. Open borders in wrestling is a great thing. It is great for the fans, and it's great for the talent. Anytime I hear the word exclusive, an exclusive deal, it makes me very queasy. I heard that report, I read that report when it was published. I did not want to see New Japan enter into any kind of exclusive arrangement with WWE. I want to see open borders between promotions, which is what we have right now with AEW and Impact, New Japan, NWA, even AAA and CMLL. They have their relationships with various promotions, not with each other, but they work with different companies as well. It is a fun time to be a fan because you never know who might show up or where, and what kind of matches you might get to see. But Danielson wanted the ability to work matches outside of WWE, and more specifically, matches in Japan. Reportedly, as part of his deal with AEW, he will have that opportunity. And he will also have creative input into his character and how he is portrayed on television. Now, AEW has stayed mum all week long on these rumors. Neither has Punk nor Bryan said anything about it, outside of an Instagram story that Punk posted with a black screen set to the song Sirius by the Alan Parsons Project, which was the entrance song for the Chicago Bulls, especially the era where Jordan won those 6 NBA titles. Punk has trolled people online before, but this feels different. Because I see people saying, Punk does this from time to time. He plays off of these rumors, and he does, but this feels different. I believe both of these reports. I believe they are both signed. I think this is the real deal. And for what it's worth, Living Color, which sings Cult of Personality, which is Punk's music, they just started following AEW on Instagram. Come on. That's all the confirmation you need, right? When people start following each other on social media. Come on. But I believe Punk is a done deal, and so is Danielson. And if they are, and I've seen this analogy used online a lot this week, because I was thinking what this reminds me of, right? We've heard of names that become available. One big name jumps from one company to the other. It's very rare when you have two big names. And for this era, for this generation, these are two big names. Okay, we're not comparing this in terms of star power to any other era. But in wrestling in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, CM Punk and Daniel Bryan are two of the biggest names in all of wrestling. And I've seen the analogy used that this would be the biggest pair of free agent signings since Scott Hall and Kevin Nash left WWE to go to WCW in 1996. And it's very true. And Scott Hall was never a world champion, like Punk was and like Bryan Danielson were. Hall may not have been a world champion, but he and Nash both walked right off of Vince's television and into another company, and they were a game changer for WCW in its, battle against WWE as the number one wrestling company in the country, which is what they became. And that was really what kicked off that whole period for them. Really kicked off the most prosperous period in the history of the business. Now, I am not saying that CM Punk and Daniel Bryan are, signing with AEW would be bigger than the NWO. That's not what I'm saying. But even if you don't like AEW, you have to admit signing both of these guys would be a very big deal. It would be a very big feather in Tony Khan's cap if he could pull this off. And we talk about other WWE guys that they've signed, or should they sign, or do they have too many of them? When you get two names like Bryan Danielson and CM Punk, even though he's been gone for a while, and they express an interest in coming in, and if you can make that deal happen, and you've got another television show coming, and you're finally done with these pandemic shows, and you're getting back out on the road, and you're trying to sell tickets, and you're trying to pack these venues in, and you've got a video game in development, and all of these different things that AEW has going for it, you would be a fool not to want to bring these guys into your company. TNA years ago signed several big names. They signed Hulk Hogan, and they signed Ric Flair. Kurt Angle was their single most important acquisition. And he had an impact, no pun intended, on that company. I mean, as far as the matches he was able to have, the viewers that he helped bring in, at least initially, it wasn't an overwhelming number, but he did help bring in some new fans, and it generated a buzz for them that they benefited from. And Kurt Angle was a big signing. He was a mess at the time. He was still all pilled up, right? That's where the Perk Angle jokes come from. But I'll tell you what, Perk Angle was on his fucking game in the ring. I mean, that guy was locked in. You get that kind of performer, and the guy's an Olympic gold medalist. He's a former world champion in WWE. That was a huge pickup for TNA. And it did bring in some new fans. If you bring in the right people, and TNA brought in a lot of the wrong people too, but if you bring in the right people at the right time, if the stars can just align perfectly, it could be the biggest thing to happen in wrestling in a very, very long time. And the timing of it all, again, with those big shows in September, it just feels right. This could not be coming at a better time for AEW. Tony Khan has got to be licking his chops right now. I mean, we're still only in July. We may not see any of these guys until September. He's got to be just, chomping at the bit, waiting to get these guys on TV, figuring out how he's going to debut them. And it's already having an effect on tickets for the All Out pay-per-view. Ticket prices are going up. They're moving more seats. I'm sure it's going to have an effect on their stadium show in New York City. Not that there's a lot of tickets left, but whatever is left, whatever they open up, I'm sure that's going to go. And it's going to have an effect on a lot of their other shows too once this becomes real and once people actually see these two men walk out on AEW television. This will not become real to a lot of people until these people can see it for themselves with their own two eyes. And when that happens, it's going to be a lot of fun to follow along and see what happens and how they debut them and who they work with first. I don't blame people who are skeptical. Even though I believe it to be true and it seems like a done deal, there's been so many rumors over the years, more so about Punk than Bryan, because Bryan's only been, a free agent for a few months. The Punk stuff, though, has been going on since 2014. And there were a lot of fans of his who may or may not still be fans of his who have been let down when these rumors bubble up and they think he's coming back or he's going to go back to WWE, and then it doesn't happen. Or when AEW first started up and people thought Punk's going to come in, and then he didn't. They've been burned many times. Many Punk fans have been burned by these rumors before, so I get it. They're hoping that maybe it's true, but they're not going to believe it until they see it with their own eyes, and I don't blame them. Now, in AEW, you have a roster full of talent that never set foot in WWE that Punk and Bryan have never worked with before. Right? Kenny Omega, he worked Deep South for a while when they were affiliated with WWE, but I don't really count that. You've got Omega, you've got Hangman Page, you've got Darby Allin, Sammy Guevara, MJF, Lance Archer, Andrade, Malachi Black, Penta, Rey Fenix. You've got all of these people. Punk, even at 42, I don't know what he'll look like in the ring, but we know he's got the ability to talk people into their seats. And if he can still do that, he can be a very valuable asset to AEW. The value in Punk is not going in there and having 5 or 6 star matches against Kenny Omega and people like that. The value in Punk is everything else that he brings to the table. It's his voice. Danielson is almost the opposite, where I'm thinking about all the great matches he could have and all the people he could work with, both the more experienced guys and the younger guys, and that to me is what really appeals to me about him going to AEW. He walks in straight out of this year's WrestleMania main event. One of the biggest baby faces of the past 20 years. And if you don't think he can contribute in a big way, you've got blinders on. You're not a very bright person. And what excites me about Bryan is being able to see him work against the new faces, but, also work against the talent from New Japan. I think it's inevitable at this point that he's going to work dates for New Japan. That may be separate from AEW. He might not be wrestling those guys on Dynamite, but if his new deal gives him the option to book his own dates in New Japan, then that deal works for me, because I've been dying to see him step into the ring with people like Okada and Tanahashi, Ibushi, who is out dealing with aspiration pneumonia right now. He's been pulled from a whole bunch of events, but he was pulled from their big Tokyo Dome show earlier this morning. They had that Wrestle Grand Slam show. They were hoping to put a whole bunch of people in the Tokyo Dome. I think they were limited to like 5,000 because COVID it's like COVID mania is running wild over there in Japan. It's a really rough go right now for New Japan. And every time they extend these lockdowns and state of emergencies and everything, I mean, it's just killing them right now. But anyway, hopefully Ibushi gets well soon, because aspiration pneumonia does not sound like something that is a lot of fun to be dealing with. But people like that, even someone like Will Ospreay, that is what interests me as much as Bryan walking out at Arthur Ashe Stadium to Final Countdown again. The debuts are always fun, right? I mean, that's what wrestling is all about. Let's be honest. Wrestling, the really, really, really fun moments in wrestling are the returns and the debuts and the surprises. When you can actually pull off a surprise, which is tough to do. Obviously, it's not going to be much of a surprise if these guys show up, because now everybody knows about it. But that's real. I mean, it's those moments that you live for. When John Cena walked out at the end of Money in the Bank last week and got that kind of reaction that he got. It's moments like that really stick out to you, that you remember all. I mean, you can come up with a whole list of Steve Austin moments back in the Attitude Era, when The Rock came back after being away for whatever it was, 7 or 8 years. The lights go out, the lights come back on, and there's somebody standing in the ring. We just saw this on Dynamite a few weeks ago with Malachi Black. Nobody was expecting him. They thought that he wouldn't be able to even come in for another few months, and there he was. And that's why he got such a big reaction. The debuts are always fun. I mean, unless your name is Andrade, and then not so much. Punk walking out in Chicago, which is where he should make his return, I would save it for All Out. I mean, we know TNT is not a very big fan of surprises after the Sting thing, right? We had that report. They're not a very big fan of keeping things as a surprise anyway. So you can debut him on the pay-per-view and then promote his first promo for TV that Wednesday. The only thing is, if you want to get him to do more than one date in Chicago, the pay-per-view is the final Chicago date. So if you want to get more than one Chicago date out of him, you could have him walk out at the end of Dynamite. That Wednesday before All Out. Not even say a word. His music hits, he comes out, the place goes absolutely insane. And on the Friday show, you promote his first live promo in the ring for the pay-per-view that Sunday. What's he going to say? Well, you got to buy the pay-per-view to find out. He'll have a live mic in his hand and no TNT to censor him. Even as a content creator who loves talking about this stuff, I do hate the fact that this leaked early. I mean, it's giving me a ton of great material. So again, as a content creator, it's fantastic. And it gets everybody excited, and rising tides lift all ships, as they say. But I do hate the fact that this leaked early. I do wish that at least one of these debuts could have been saved as a genuine holy shit moment. It is rare that we get those anymore. AEW pulled it off with Jon Moxley at Double or Nothing 2 years ago. They did it recently with Malachi Black. But it leaked, and Tony Khan is not denying it, which I think says a lot. Without him actually saying anything at all. I would think after what happened with Christian Cage, where a lot of people were very underwhelmed, that they hyped up this surprise and then Christian walks out, but they made such a big deal out of it that it felt underwhelming. And I would think, and I would hope, that Tony Khan learned from that experience, and if everybody is letting their imagination run wild on this and there's no truth to it, that they would have put the kibosh on it by now. And again, the fact that they haven't, I think, speaks volumes. How you debut them is another question. You don't debut them together on the same night when you can get 2 big moments out of it instead of 1. You space them out. Punk in Chicago, Bryan in New York. Maybe both rubbing shoulders with Hangman Page, right? Let's say if he doesn't win the championship from Kenny Omega, if they wrestle it all out, it's not official yet. They come in maybe kind of backing him up against the Elite. He needs some help. The Dark Order's not cutting it. And in comes Punk and in comes Bryan, clearing the way for Hangman to eventually win the title from Omega, maybe in the rematch. That way, it doesn't vault them immediately into title contention. It gives some rub to their biggest babyface, but it also sets the stage for the eventual dream matches with Punk against Omega and Bryan against Omega, maybe even Bryan against Punk. I'd like to see that match too. It's been almost a decade since we've gotten it. There's lots of different ways that you can go with this. But for me, and this is the other important part, right? I know everybody is excited about the possibility of these guys coming in, and it's drumming up a ton of excitement. But there's one thing that can't be lost in all of this, and I'm hoping that Tony Khan and AEW does not lose sight of what's important here. This, to me, does not change the path for Hangman Page. You cannot have 2 ex-WWE guys come right in at the same time that Hangman Page loses. Let's say if he goes to All Out and he loses, and then you cast him aside almost as an afterthought. If he does not win that championship at some point this year, you risk cooling him off. He may never recover from that. He may still be very popular, but he may not be as popular as he is now. That is the risk that you run if you wait too long. It reminds me of Naito in New Japan, when he didn't win the title of Wrestle Kingdom, when everybody thought he was going to, and everybody thought it was the right time for him to. He didn't. And eventually he did. It was like a year later. Eventually he did. But I don't know. He didn't feel as hot as he was the first time. It felt like they just waited too long. Sometimes, you know what exit you have to get off at. And you said, whatever, I'll get off at the next exit. No, the exit is right here. This is where you need to go. And sometimes when you wait just a little bit too long, it's just not the same. These crowds right now are all in to see Hangman take the title at All Out. These 2 signings should not change a thing about that. Because right now, the fans are very excited to see Punk and Bryan in AEW. If you push your young, homegrown star off to the side for 2 ex-WWE guys, I'm telling you, you will kill whatever goodwill that you have built up with your audience. And you might actually turn people against Punk and Bryan. They might start to resent them. And that would be the worst thing that Tony Khan could do right now, when these next 6 to 12 months should be the absolute biggest in AEW history.